it will start now. Thank you and welcome, Dr. Debashish ji. It has been a great privilege to interact with you, talk with you. It has been always very inspiring and thought-provoking to listen to you. And after listening to your talk, which you have given in the series Swatantra Bharat 75, The Genius of India as the Key to the Crisis of Humanity, we thought that probably we can put some questions to you to understand more about this subject. So I will try to ask some questions, and then of course you can, we can discuss around those questions. The very first thing which I found in your speech, beginning part of it, very interesting part is you have reversed the order. You said, let us slightly reverse it. We'll say crisis of humanity and how the key, the key can be the genius of India. And that I found very interesting because you have changed the order with some purpose. And you said that when we say genius of India, it should not be taken as something to be boasted or egoistic about, because it's not individual ego or national ego. It is something to do about the soul. And jinn, if I remember it, you also derived from the jinn. And so can you just elaborate a little more on that? This nation soul concept comes again and again in Sri Aurobindo and Mother's works also. And of course, Nalinda and other people have also wrote about that. So nation soul, and I remember in one place in Renaissance in India essay, he says, in the beginning, there is a characteristic soul which India must preserve and yet give the new forms to the, the rhythms which are actually required now. So can you please elaborate on this particular idea of soul and keeping that intact, how that actually is?
Yeah, thank you, Narendra. So yes, I did invert the order of your topic title, and actually I also realized later that I changed it a little bit. It doesn't really matter because I think your topic said the genius of India and the crisis of humanity, but I somehow read it as the crisis of civilization. But in a way, it's the same, because when we talk about crisis of civilization, we are talking about a world civilization in which we live today. And I try to point out that this world civilization is a contemporary thing. We never had a world civilization like this before, and it has historically taken over us right now. Similarly, the idea of humanity is a modern thing, is a contemporary thing. We never thought of ourselves as a single species, as a humanity until this time. So idea of civilization as a single civilization and idea of humanity as a single humanity are both modern ideas. So I started by talking about that because in a way that is what confronts us. And how do we respond to it? And is there a characteristic way of responding to it that India can give? You see, so these are the questions. That's why I inverted it. And the characteristic way that India can, respond to this is not so much a question of self-congratulation. That we've been great and we've answered all the solutions, and that's our genius. We're a genius nation. But rather, I took your term genius in the sense, as you mentioned, of the notion of the spirit entity, jinn, as you said, jinn, which has become, which is really a kind of a Persian term, which talks about the spirit, right? So the spirit entity of the nation, is there a spirit entity of the nation? Is the nation a spirit? This is also a very interesting idea, because I try to point out that in modern times, at least, we get this notion of the nation as a spirit, which arises as a kind of an idea during the nationalist period, but it traces its modern genealogy to Europe and to Germany, to the 19th century, when thinkers like Herder and Hegel are talking about the world in terms of different nation souls. So idea of nation soul in modern times comes from that. And you brought up the issue, I think in your next, as we'll discuss it, we'll think about Germany's role in all this, these ideas.
Yeah.
But if we go back to did India ever have the notion of a nation soul, right? Or is it a purely modern idea? You know, I mean, we can go back very ancient, even to something like the Devi Sukta, right, where the term the Devi Vakambrini is announcing herself as Rashtri.
Mm,
You know,
mm,
the
yeah.
term Rashtri um, could actually be conceived of as a nation soul, the spirit of the nation, of the Rashtra. But this idea gets lost. We don't really have this idea through the history of Indian, civilization. We don't really think of ourselves as a nation in that sense. As Sri Aurobindo says, through the entire history of India, never the subcontinent is united until the British come, right? Ashoka unites as much as he can, right up to the southern part, but still something remains. The power of independence is so great in the various regions of India. So when we talk about nation soul, um, we have to think about this kind of entire subcontinent as an entity, a spirit entity. And is there a spirit entity? So this is exactly where, I mean, Bharat Mata, for example, which is a nationalistic idea, um, begins to come into the horizon of the nation as a subjective reality. you
Mm,
know we belong to this nation as a single soul, as a single spirit. And how are we to relate to that? How are we to conceive of that? I think this is, I mean, we can explore this idea a little more as we go along,
yeah.
but this is the way in which I see it. It is, in a way, in our times, a modern idea which is arising with nationalism, and it is related to ideas of nations that are coming up from about the 19th century in Europe. These ideas have problems to them. They are problematic ideas. But Sri Aurobindo is, we have to look at exactly what he's saying, and we'll see how he transforms those ideas as an aspect of, kind of a counter, sort of knowledge to what is being offered by the notion of a nation in Europe, etc.
Yeah.
So just to touch on, and we will move on, but just to touch on this idea of a nation that is coming from 19th century, and why is it coming at all? Um, it's coming as an aspect of modernity, which is really a systematic turn to rationalize the world. We are
Mm,
trying to give a kind of a understanding of everything. And this rational turn is really a turn which is mental and ideological. So one of the main problems of the mind is that it looks at things in exclusive forms. So it is going to divide the world up, and it's ideal that everybody has a separate identity. So we have different identities across the world. And when we talk about India as a nation soul, we are sort of buying into that idea that we are a unique kind of people. But along with that, in the mental idea, these are exclusivities. Each one is its own kind of world. And this idea has ultimately led to some very dangerous, consequences. For example, the idea of the German nation. This is
sure.
where the whole notion of the true and false subjectivism comes in.
Correct. Correct.
Um, the Second World War is really, a pitting of nation souls, we may say, against each other, thought of from a mental point of view. Japan thinking of itself as the land of the rising sun, which needs to dominate other places. Germany thinking of itself as the soul, which is the most elite soul, in which the rebirth of the very essence of the West has taken place and it needs to dominate the world. These kind of ideas of exclusivities that are in competition with other exclusivities
Mm.
is part of the legacy of the Dacian soul. That is a dangerous legacy. This is the reason why, to some extent, people don't like to use that term today. It's seen as a problematic term. But instead of throwing it away, if we look at the kind of reformulation that people like Sri Aurobindo are giving it, then we find that it's an alternative idea that is resting on a different definition of the human and of a different definition of humanity, which is a psychic definition, a definition that goes to the individuation of the divine or the individuation of the one in infinite beings, so to say.
True, true. Very interesting. And in fact, I was coming to that point when you said Germany's example, because
Yeah.
Sherbindo cites it very well. And he says the German error. He mentions that true they had a chance to go to the true subjectivity, but for the as we all know, World War and all that thing which happened, it turned to a false subjective where a national ego was mistaken for a maybe the national spirit or the soul. And then after that, my question was, he has made another very interesting observation. He says, even though Germany was defeated in the war, it was victorious in its, what you can say, its ideal or its idea that a national ego was mistaken for a national spirit. Because most of the nations which defeated Germany were actually thereafter following the same ideal. I found this observation very, very, you can say, I mean, maybe only Sherbindo can make this type of subtle observations, because he says they were defeated in the war, but they actually won in the perpetuating of their idea. And second idea I think Germany had is to grow at the expense of the others. Such fierce competition between the nations that they do not mind even, destroying the others so that they can expand. So, how do you see this insight of Sherbindo? This is something very interesting.
Absolutely, absolutely, Narendra. And this is exactly what I was talking about, which is, that it starts in places like Germany, and it has a kind of an idealistic air to it. But it also has, if we look at the history of these ideas in Germany, there is always a certain kind of superiority complex. I mean, German philosophers from the 18th century onwards, the entire movement of the Enlightenment is dominated by Germans. And we find that again and again, even figures like Hegel, like Kant, even Nietzsche, there is a certain underlying sense of the superiority of the German. We have achieved this. We have the best thinkers. We have the best poets, the best musicians, best, the cream of humanity. And Hegel is talking about how the spirit of the time, zeitgeist,
Mm.
which again we are talking about Jin, about the
Yeah.
genius of the world, the earth, you may say, is moving from nation to nation, right? The zeitgeist carries out an experiment, the supreme experiment, in some place like Greece, and then it moves, it leaves it behind. It carries out an experiment in China and India, and fossilizes it, leaves it behind, and moves on. This idea of something becoming static, right, is an aspect of this mental exclusivity of the soul,
Sure.
you know and so this ultimately, now it has come to Germany, and we are the superior nation. It is our mission to give the cream of world thought to the entire world. And so that's the idealistic part, but it is hand in glove with the egoistic part. It's a very important point, and I think we need to pay heed to it, because it's still living with us, this false notion of a superior nation, that this self-congratulatory idea of the nation, that we are in somehow special, right? So rather than saying we are unique but we are the same, we don't say that. We always turn to we are special rather than, we are the same, but just we are in unique expression of the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that, as you said, I mean, it led to a kind of holocaust in which this idea of the competitive nation, the self-aggrandizing nation, um, pitched itself against others. And this idea was not so settled in the others. It's like they say, when you throw a pebble in the pond, the ripple starts spreading out. And so the consequence of the two world wars, and Sri Aurobindo is pointing out, he's writing this during the First World
Sure.
War,
Sure.
the whole idea of true and false subjectivism. And after the Second World War, he's only writing a footnote saying that what I said during the First World War is even more true today
Yes.
after the Second World War.
True.
So it leads to this kind of distribution of the idea. And in a way, the antagonists swallow the virus of the idea, and it becomes universalized. So today it lives on in some kind of way within almost the kind of, I mean, the genetic makeup of the national ego, not the national soul, but the national ego, which it is very, very, easy to mistake for the national soul.
True. True. In fact, I remember Swami Vivekananda's one quotation. He was maybe he was right, as just like Sri Aurobindo, when he said that each nation has a destiny to fulfill, each nation has a note to play in the march of the nations. It has got a message to deliver for the. I mean, each one has got a unique, as you said, there's a unique message, unique note to be played along with the other unique notes which are going to be played. That's how going to be the harmony
Yeah,
of
and,
all the
and
nations.
also, Narendra, what we need to understand about this is that, I mean, Sri Aurobindo is also talking, if you look at his chapter on internationalism, in that same
True.
social and political thought, um, he's saying that, I mean, we can use a term convergent pluralism, which is a contemporary way of thinking about it, that not only are they unique, each one is evolving. They are not static. Each one
True.
is
True. True.
evolving towards universality. Each
Hmm.
one is taking the others into itself as in its own way, so that each one is growing towards a convergence. Now, that where is that convergence? We can discuss that as we go along.
Sure.
But basically, we have to recognize the fact that this is the point Sri Aurobindo is making about the nation soul knows its oneness with others
Hmm.
and its uniqueness, in the whole, you know.
True. True.
So that it is evolving around some ideas of the divine, some self, kind of truths of the divine. And at the same time, it knows its oneness and its universality, that it is evolving to include the others into itself.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a living thing happening. It's not something which is static, and that's actually
Right,
the
right.
whole India's model. Maybe that's where we can take clue from the beginning. We thought of this. Shavindo in one of his essay mentions that we never had machine as a model for the universe. We always thought of a tree or a honeycomb, or it was an organic model. I think he mentions in his ideal of a karma yogi in essays
Yeah.
that that is very significant. The ideal of a Virata Purusha or a Ashwatha or a cosmic tree, any organic model always signifies a growth or a liveliness in its, and all branches can come from different directions, will have a different direct way of growing up, but ultimately they all are going through the same roots. So
Yes.
something like that, I think that was the model which we need to revive. uh,
I completely, yes,
so that
absolutely.
is where I think he was significant, that there was no mechanistic model. Maybe as you rightly mentioned, in the modern age, when the mechanistic ideal or the rationalistic ideal became supreme, this reductionist, what you mentioned as dividing
Yeah,
the things and exclusivity, became more
yeah,
prominent. And one of the idea in the political arena was the this particular peculiarity of only having supremacy of one over the other. So which was
yeah,
not actually the truth.
yeah.
I what I found another, yeah, please.
Yeah, no, no, yes, because when we are exclusive, that's all we can do. When we are exclusive, when we talk about uniqueness in exclusive terms, then all we can do is either exist in competition,
Mm,
the problem of coexistence is again one of the laws of mind, is that it pushes towards unity, you
mm,
know. So how do we discover unity if we can't unite, if we are, separately, exclusively, unique, so to say? Then we either discover a kind of a, compromised unity, in which we act as if we are equal but we think that we are unequal, right?
mm, mm,
Or
mm.
we achieve a unity in which we try to dominate others, which is what we see all around us in the world, superpower politics,
True, true.
geopolitics, right? Some nations, act in a condescending way towards others, but actually bring them under their sphere of influence, or we try to swallow up the other, right? Create expansionist, empires,
Mm.
or we try to eliminate the other, right? All these solutions are what comes across when we have nations that are exclusive, you know.
True,
But
true.
this paradoxical idea of the one and infinite at the same time, that the soul, everything in nature is that the soul is really in its depths, not exclusive from others, but the
True,
same as every other, you
true,
know,
true.
exploring its own evolution in its own unique way, but not separating itself or knowing itself as, in competition with others.
What I found here, yes, very rightly, sir. And what I found here is, this paradox. And the modern physics also has been telling that now with the new discoveries, they started telling maybe paradox is the language of nature, because in nature, everything is able to cope up with the paradox very harmoniously. There is so much of silence and peace when they are having so much of complementarity and not competition in them. And probably one of the idea was not to have such gaps between apparent opposite things in the all the ancient civilizations including India. Maybe there was no gap between secular and spiritual, there was no gap between science and the spirituality, there was no gap between uh, microcosm and macrocosm. So apparent divisions and the oppositions which we found in the recent times were actually very easily coped up by the ancients or the all these cultures which were close to the nature including Indian, and therefore there was much harmonious understanding of the whole. Is that true? Maybe.
Well, I'd say, I mean, that's true to some extent, but I agree completely with you that modernity brings a certain exacerbation of differences because of the law of mind, But I wouldn't say that the pre-modern was seamlessly, kind of, without any dichotomies or differences. I think we made our own solutions, and it was never so distinct. For example, if you look at Indian history, we find that we developed the distinction between samsara and sannyasa, right? But they were closely tied. In other
Mm,
words, that's where the sannyasi had a place in samsara. The sannyasi, though the sannyasi was at the periphery of samsara, thereby being given the freedom from samsara in a social sense, uh, could come into, I mean, was an equal, visitor to the polis and supported by the polis. The pre-modern sannyasi was supported by the polis. That's why they could exist. So that kind of a system in which the differences were accommodated in a single system, not that differences did not exist or were not made, but they were made, but not made exclusive, not
true,
made
true,
to war against each other, you
true,
know.
true.
I mean, in nature, again, the same thing, the predator and the prey are there. The predator devours the prey, but they're under some kind, the predator doesn't always, if you look at the plains of Serengeti, you'll find that lions are coexisting with the deer and the buffalo. For most of the time, nothing is going on. Then suddenly there's a kind of a chase, and there's one particular animal that gets devoured. Now, they're obeying some kind of an instinct of homeostasis, an instinct of unity, of ecological unity, uh, that belongs to the law of the vital. you know Similarly, the pre-modern, even as far as the human is concerned, has not split off the law of the mind from the law of the vital. They
Mm.
are coexisting. That's why, as you said, there is a certain organicity to it and an accommodation of differences. Not that there are no differences, but the differences don't split off from each other to become exclusive competitive realities.
True, very true, very nicely told. I was just reading through some of your interest, and I was just slightly taking a different question. But when I was reading, I was fascinated to know. Just I'm reading exactly that the areas are as diverse as culture studies, pre-modern, modern, contemporary Indian, Japanese, Islamic, transnational art history, Savitri, the life divine, Gita, Upanishad, comparative mysticism, subjective science, multimedia authoring, jazz, Sri Aurobindo, Kumaraswamy, Avindranath, and so many. The list further goes in Derrida and all these people. So I was wondering, just to ask you that how you are able to, see so many subjects. Just now you mentioned the way to that there are different things, but one should be able to connect them. So, or there is some invisible thread which is connecting, right? So, is that what actually you get interested into all these subjects? How do you see this? Because generally people get specialized in one area and then they sort of exclusively see to that only. How do you see this particular?
Yeah, Narendra, I think that's a very good point. What you just made right at the end, that people get specialized. I think that also is an aspect of our time.
Yeah,
Modernity specializes us. We've seen 500 years of specialization, and it
true,
gets
true,
narrower and narrower, right?
true, true.
It's like fragmentation to the extreme, and somebody knows a lot about something
Only
very
that small
small.
thing. Yeah.
Right, right. And I think if we talk about the 21st century, I think we are suddenly being pushed into a new age.
Hmm.
And one of the kind of keynotes of that new age is the reversal of that specialization. We have to move towards integration. But
Hmm.
the integration, the integral, is not something which we just pull things under a single idea. We are not trying to tie things under a single idea. The true integral actually releases the plurality. In a sense, we must explore all our interests. And all these figures that you mentioned are unique, just like we are talking about
True,
nations.
true.
And they have their own flavor, they have their own knowledge, they have their own domain. These domains overlap, you know
Hmm. Hmm.
but in a sense, I would say every individual has got plurality of interests, plurality of approaches to reality, plurality of forms of knowledge that they are exploring. And in that sense, what we find is that what unites it all is really the one. I mean, there is the one that is infinite. And so, what we make of them and the world that we construct from the overlapping of all these knowledges, is part of the synthetic evolution of the individual and of the soul. You were talking of the soul. The soul, embraces heterogeneity. It is still unique, but it embraces heterogeneity and tries to build its own world out of that. So I think I'm very interested in that uh, growth into a certain integrality in my own way, and I invite everybody to do the same.
But that's pretty fascinating actually, because we need. I had read somewhere, sir, that now we need more and more generalist, not the specialist, because the age of specialty is gone now, and we need just opposite of that, people who are knowing a lot of subjects, because probably that is what exactly you pointed out, that when you are trying to understand so many things, maybe you understand that one which is behind all those things, and you get some very clue of that. Uh, maybe something
It's
similar to.
actually it's a paradox, Narendra, because I think that's exact. I think what we are being called on is the two at the same time. We need to know the uniqueness of everything that we encounter as a specific relationship, and at the same time, we need to see the one behind it. That's the paradoxical invitation of our
True,
times.
true, true. And that's the most fascinating adventure maybe of consciousness. Maybe I may, if I may use the term, it's an adventure of consciousness, because ultimately it's a consciousness which is singular and not plural, to use the term of
Yes.
some of the scientists. And that same consciousness, ekam sat vipara, must be behind all these things, as you must have been exploring and experiencing. But the near list makes it very interesting to see that on one hand there is Shabin, on the other side there is jazz, and so many apparently unconnected but actually connected things are being explored, which I
Yeah.
think should be the norm of coming education. I think this is the way education should be for children and the youths when they go to schools, colleges. They should be probably encouraged to do something like this. This is what my thought was. Maybe you are trying something in that direction to, how bring people can be given cross-disciplinary or transdisciplinary things to connect with each other.
Yeah.
There is something which I heard about in the similar lines, that when Gregory Betson, I don't remember the name, but the person was telling about the pattern which connects everything, and he was saying that he was talking to Fritjof Capra, and he was telling that there is a pattern which is connecting everything in the universe, and that is connecting you and me also. He was telling the Capra that there is a pattern which connects everything from sun to the moon to the walls to the houses to the rivers, and this uh, everything for that matter, and ultimately that is connecting you and me. So is that where the mysticism and the science and the philosophy and all are trying to point out to, that there is something which is connecting everything?
Yeah, you're right. I think we can look at it in two ways. One is that there is a pattern that connects everything, and another is that there is one that expresses itself in infinite ways, and we construct the pattern that connects it all. So in
Okay.
a way, evolution, or if we think about life as becoming, if we think about life as evolution, perhaps those connections are not given to us. Perhaps what is given to us is the one and the many at the same time,
Okay.
as two poles. This is the whole idea of the sacrifice of Purusha. Purusha is one but becomes many. Now, what is our work in it, in evolution, is to unite the two, is
Mm,
to, without erasing the two, right?
right.
Yeah. Can we discover the oneness in the manyness? Then thereby we form the synthesis of the one. And that synthesis of the one is unique again from individual to individual. It cannot be a universal pattern, just like what Sri Aurobindo is talking about, the overmind. In the overmind, you have infinite ideas of universality.
Mm, mm,
This is why we have so many religions that are each universal. Each one can give you a picture of the universe.
mm,
It doesn't make it, each one is right, but it doesn't make it integral. It doesn't make it complete. What makes it integral is one step further, where you know that the one can have infinite expressions, and it does not need to bring it under a single law. That law exists. That when you're talking about that pattern is a very deep pattern. That pattern is the real idea, as Sri Aurobindo is saying,
yeah.
the supramental real idea, which is almost, one may say, a fractal pattern, which
Mm,
is expressing um, differently, but in the same way in everything in the universe. I think
true.
that's what he means by that pattern that is
Correct.
everywhere,
Correct.
to see that there are these structures that ultimately answer to something hidden, very deeply hidden, and that we are involved in expressing that. So in a way, we are making the pattern, but it
Mhm,
also already exists. Both things
mhm.
are happening in time. One is pre temporal, and the other is an aspect of time
Aspect of it.
becoming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's something, another, I mean, even more fascinating, because It's both, actually, both at a time.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. What I found in Sri Aurobindo's writings or Mother's writing, all these writings are, in this, when we talk of pattern, something came to my mind immediately was mandala and all that, something which is actually taking shape of some artistic form. And probably that is why art somehow is able to, reach to that where many times the rational mind is not able to go, but the artist mind, a poet's mind, is easily able to fathom to those unfathomable depths and suddenly come out with some discerning truth which can be useful for a larger
yeah,
humanity. So we say that that which even a Ravi cannot see, a sun cannot see, a Kavi can see. And that Kavi or the Manushi and all that, Sri Aurobindo uses him as a seer, is not just a poet for the sake of it or artist. And I think he gave a lot of importance to art in many of his writings, whether in Foundations of Indian Culture or National Value of Art or many other theses he has
brain of
given.
India.
Yeah, yeah. So that is very important. I wanted to ask because I know you have been very, you can say, you have got such a insightful all your studies and other things in art as a whole. So how do you see role of a art in the this evolution of consciousness, or what exactly the uniqueness or the role of art is going to be? How do you
Yeah,
see it,
yes,
look at it?
yes, yes. So you're very right, because I see you see that when we approach knowledge through the mind, we do tend to cut it up, and we see it in terms of these relations between laws, and again this notion of exclusivities, uh, that seem to have mechanical boundaries, just like you're pointing out about artificial creations, right? So what we find is that mental understanding is always looking for these laws that can connect or tie things together. But when we find, but we have other ways of knowing, right? We have ways of knowing. You're pointing to artistic ways of knowing, and Sri Aurobindo is pointing to four kinds of modes of knowledge in the supermind. So just like we have something which is objectified knowledge,
Hmm.
vigyan, I mean, it's the mental aspect of vijnana. That's why vijnana in our modern usage means science, right? It's the common term for science, So, but he's talking about samgyana as well, and
True.
samgyana he's saying is sense knowledge. Sense
Hmm.
knowledge is really this kind of what you're calling artistic knowledge. Is there a way of knowing things by the senses,
Senses.
you know and those kind of ways of, and just like you started off by talking about the pre-modern and the organic way in which things were connected, we have a intuitive understanding of reality which precedes and succeeds the mind. The
Hmm.
mind can be led by it. Our artistic intuitions give us a open a door to the one, a door to unity, which the mind finds very difficult. And if we open to it through that, through the samgyana, then this mental vijnana um, follows that, and
Hmm.
can intuit that and can actually express that. That's the manishi. You are talking about the kavi and the manishi,
Like,
right? um, you said Ravi, Kavi, and Manishi. Ravi is the logocentric, the sun, which shows its light everywhere, and you can see all the laws. Everything is clear. It's contained within a single law. Um, but the Kavi sees the truths of God in a imaginative sense and through
hmm.
the senses,
Hmm.
and so it leads you beyond some kind of a rational construction, the constructed nature of things. And the Manishi that comes after that can actually intuit that which the mind by itself cannot intuit.
True,
So
true.
I feel that the arts are a subjective knowledge, a way to approach reality, which is deeper and more intuitive through, what Sri Aurobindo calls direct inner knowledge,
Mm.
direct inner contact. He's talking about knowledge by external contact,
Extent.
indirect knowledge by external contact, indirect knowledge by internal contact, direct knowledge by internal contact, and knowledge by identity, you know.
Knowledge. Yeah.
So, this direct knowledge by internal contact, which comes from our intuitions of sense, our intuitions of art and music, it opens us to deeper sort of sense of the whole than the mind can. The mind can follow it if it
True.
opens to that. So I feel that, in our times, it's very important for people to develop that intuition, the intuition of the poetic, the intuition of the artistic, of the samgyana.
That was really wonderful, because I was wondering how I always thought that yes, art has the way to go, and then you told that now you have really put it in the right words how this whole journey should be happening. Or right, I think this whole turn to subjectivity, what he has mentioned, also was through the art. Many places we found that this when this turn to the subjective age was visible, maybe many places it was the artist who took the lead. Am I right? They showed the path ahead, whether it was Bengal School of Art, which happened during the Renaissance time of India, all this Rabindranath Tagore and other people, or in Europe also, it was the artist probably who actually showed the path. So this turn to the subjectivity, what we are talking, the next stage in our evolutionary phase, that also maybe is laid by the artist. Is that the
Yeah, I agree. I agree, Narendra, because you're quite right. I mean, I think we get inspirations. You were talking about the nation soul. The nation soul expresses itself first through inspirations. Think of the poem Bande Mataram, which came as a kind of a inspired vision in the mind of Bankim Chandra, and he
yeah,
wrote it in a novel, Ananda Math. But it actually shines out, and people like Sri Aurobindo, I mean, the whole journal Bande Mataram, and his making of that into a national poem and a national slogan almost.
true,
Um,
true.
it gives voice to the nation soul, you know, in a kind of an image and in words that we imaginatively experience in a much deeper way at the level of the soul, uh, much more than if somebody wrote out the greatness of India and this, that, the other. So I completely agree with you that it's the artists, the poets that receive the visions and the inner inspirations by which the intangible future oneness comes to the human mind, and then the thinking follows that and actually creates the structures that are necessary to
True, true,
manifest that.
true. But that cannot take place of the the it cannot be the leader, it cannot be only the follower. That's what I mean. It cannot be a
Yes.
master of the whole journey. That's what I
I
think your point. And
Yes.
Shabind also mentions that as office and limitations of reason, where he
Yes.
mentions that these are the limitations of reason, but yes, it has got a role to play and it is going to play the role. But the next leap is going to be taken from the mind only, from the
Yes.
springboards of mind, he says, but not without that intuition or the illumination, which is going to actually lead the way. uh,
Yes.
what I found another interesting thing in your talk also, and the other parts which are mentioned by Shabind or Mother, is the emphasis on supra-rational beauty. Because when we are talking of art, art is all about maybe the pursuit of the beauty, or the pursuit of the divine in material form is actually beauty, Shabindo says. So when you're looking at the whole idea of beauty, many times in history, the pursuit of beauty was considered as opposite to pursuit of ethics or the good, and that battle has been going on for a long time, that if you pursue good, then you cannot be have a pursuit of aesthetics or beauty, and vice versa. But then here we find a synthesis where there can be both beauty and good. They can be supra-rational, they can both actually exceed the reason, and maybe they will both will be coming to the same thing somewhere. Is that so? Or how this
Yeah,
opposition is not actually the reality. It was the case in the past, but maybe the good and the beauty need not be opposite to each other. They both can transcend reason. Is that right? My understanding?
yeah, I think you are quite right, Narendra. So, I mean, you actually mentioned Satyam, Shivam, Sundaram, which is a
Yeah,
trinity
yeah, yeah.
that comes to us from the Veda. And, from Plato in the Western tradition, you have this other trinity that you just mentioned. Actually, it's truth, goodness, and beauty, right?
Mm,
Truth, goodness, and beauty, which really map to Satyam, Shivam, and Sundaram. Sri Aurobindo sees these as three suns, that they're ideals, they're suns. Each one is a supra rational goal of
mm,
the human journey. And to some extent, again, when we are talking about plurality, we have people with a predominance of, a certain approach. Some people are more ethical, some people are more aesthetic, some people are more philosophical. They're
mm,
looking for truth, they're looking for the laws of the world. Some people are looking for the ultimate good of the world. So what Sri Aurobindo is saying is that each one of these pursuits is legitimate in its own right. Each one is being attracted by its own sun, the sun of suprarational beauty or the sun of suprarational good. And we must follow that. But as we rise, we find that they exist almost in a community with each other. They imply each other. The closer we come, the more integral it becomes. We find that supreme form, Tat Savitur Varam Rupam, that auspicious form. Varam Rupam is that form which is the integral form. It's the form that actually includes the good, the beautiful, and the truthful all at once.
mhm.
So I think this integral is really what is attracting us. But because of our fragmented nature, we have individual attractions towards either ethics or aesthetics or philosophical truth. And I think it's legitimate to follow whatever it is that attracts us with an openness to include the other as we move along.
True, true. In fact, what came to my mind was one of the places he says that today's crisis seems to be a multi-dimensional crisis, multidisciplinary crisis, but ultimately at the root of it, it is a evolutionary crisis. That seems to be true because all these crises are actually pointing to the same crisis of evolution. And in that,
Yes,
that crisis, Shrabindo mentions in one of his essays that India can, if she wills, give a decisive turn uh, to over which the whole mankind is stumbling. That was
yes,
his vision and wish, and his five dreams also point out to what he talked on the 15th August. He said
yes,
that India and then Asia and they're becoming one, and ultimately the whole humanity will become one. But he also mentions if there is a appearance of an ideal on a horizon, it shows nature's intention. And even though today we find that it is totally unthinkable for us, the very appearance shows that at one point or the other point it is going to happen, eventuality of it. So after 100 years or more than 100 years of all these sayings, how do you see at these things? I mean, how they have, how far we are going in that direction, or maybe we have somewhere we have been just slower than what was expected by him. How is your understanding about this?
yeah. Time is such a mystery, Narendra. We cannot really tell what looks like tomorrow to a seer like Sri Aurobindo could be, 500 years to our mortal time. But I think to some extent, it's also the movement of history is sort of unpredictable. In Sri Aurobindo's own case, we know, for example, that when, in the 1940s or in the late 1930s, he was expecting the descent of the supermind imminently. And then, the Second World War happened. And he has, in several places, stated how the looming clouds of war from the 40s, threw a spanner in the works. He did not expect it. Once it happened, it threw everything off, and his own passage in 1950, the way in which I'd say the project uh, took a detour. That's how I see it. And I think that detour is still with us today. But maybe detours are also necessary from a certain point of view to universalize that which has not yet been touched. Everything has to come into the work, so to say, for an age to change. You know, so we're still integrating the great ideas that you're talking about. We are still integrating the vision and the truth that is with us today. In the beginning is prepared the close. That beginning has been laid, but we are trying to catch up with it, as a race, as a humanity. So, from that point of view, I think the evolution, the crisis of evolution, as you mentioned, when we talk about the crisis of civilization, it is a crisis of evolution because it is really pushing us beyond the regime of mind. Even the fact that modernity is a regime of mind like never before, and you're talking about the pre modern and the modern, is an evolutionary step. We can't go back to the past. We can go into the future in which we exceed mind, that which mind has released, the notion of differences, the notion of plurality, of relativism. We can exceed it by finding a one which is plural at the same time. you know and this is really the evolutionary problem of our time. Can we find the one in the middle of the many? Can we find the one that stands behind the many? Can we find various ones that the many can voice, you know, among themselves and with each other? These are forms of oneness that we are invited to in a post rational way, I would say, that forms the transition to supermind, to a next evolutionary stage that is yet to come because we don't have the organs for it as yet.
In fact, your speech actually ends with this interesting note. Your last sentence is that is what Sri Aurobindo says, supermind, and then it is such a end of that piece of talk that it, surely makes one to think what will be the next now. Do we need to know more about supermind? So, and that today this question also actually came to that point also. Will you like to just tell us little more about this whole idea of supermind and how that is going to come? Maybe that will be the interesting thing.
Yeah, I think we've been skirting around that idea in our entire
Entire talk,
conversation
yeah, yeah.
because it's the paradox. It's really what the mind finds very paradoxical. We see an example, a vision of the supermind given in the Gita, for example, when Arjuna asks Krishna, "Show me who you really are." What is normally called the Vishwarupa. He says, humans have not seen it, but I will gift you the vision, the divine vision, the divine eye by which you can see it. And what he sees or what he experiences is so paradoxical. You know, you talked about supra-rational beauty, for example. Kant talks about the sublime. The difference between normal beauty and supra-rational beauty is that supra-rational beauty is sublime, and sublimity overpasses the mind. It transcends the mind, so that the mind cannot really grasp it. It only is dazzled by it. So Arjuna is dazzled, and not only dazzled, it tears his mind apart. He begs Krishna to come back to his universal form, his four-handed form, as he says. And that kind of vision that he's given, if you read the description, it's totally paradoxical. It's one and many at the same time. It's all the past, all the present, and all the future in one body. It's a mass of light. It's a mass of uh, unformed and formless light. yet it's a single person. You know, these paradoxes cannot be encompassed by the mind, which has to see one at one time.
Connect.
It can either be this or it can be that. Can it be all these things at once? Can it be infinity in one glance? Not just as a trance, not as a shushupti or a turiya, but as a waking experience
Awakening.
in
Yeah.
which we live. This is the supramental transition, and it's way beyond our present capacity. That's why the mother says it's further from the human than the human is from the animal.
True.
So, but the difference is that we can actually form the intermediate structures. This is the great gift that Sri Aurobindo and the mother have given. They're inviting us as humans to utilize consciousness. You started by talking about, the adventure of consciousness,
Mm.
the experiment of consciousness. So we can form the intermediate states by which we can stabilize our transition to this kind of paradoxical consciousness. And it's only when we achieve that, we won't achieve that immediately, but as we move towards these states of the holding together of the many and the one, the discovery of plurality and unity at the same time in many ways, all that we've been talking about, the experience of the senses, the experience of art, of music, um, to encompass the sublime, and the mind opening up its inner layers, the subtler layers of mind, which experience what the logical external mind does not understand. you know so those kind of, that's the subjective, that's what he's calling the subjective age,
Subjective. Yeah.
the entry into the subjective age. That is what we are invited into, to prepare us to come to the point where we can overcome the crisis of civilization, which is the crisis of universal mind in modern humanity.
Debashish sir, this was a fascinating discussion, I must say, and I almost come to the end of my questions, which I thought I should be asking you, but you have told me much more than what actually I was asking with the questions. It has flowed very beautifully, and I must thank you from the bottom of my heart for giving your time as well as your all insights into this very important subject. Uh, uh, Let me express my gratitude and thanks to you, sir, for being there and showing this very wonderful, insightful journey through entire this subject. And it will truly fit to the theme which we were exploring. And we look forward to more and more such conversations or understandings from you. Uh, Thank you so much once again. I hope I have not taken more time of yours, but I could not resist to ask you all these things. And
No,
thankfully,
thank
you
you.
you replied also very much. It went very organically. So I once again express my deep regards and thanks to you, gratitude to you. And this series of Genius of India as a key to the crisis of humanity, or the reverse, whatever you may say, truly needs to be explored further, and more thoughts and more deliberations or maybe creations will be required to really take it forward. So,
I agree. Thank you, Narendra. And, I think in parting, I'd like to say, I think these are very profound ideas. The idea of the entire title, it's an inviting title which has a lot of profundity to it, and particular the notion of the nation soul.
yeah,
I think people really need to think about it and really need to, understand it in its depths. We are not here to throw it out, and we are not here to misunderstand it,
true.
which is really the two options that are glaring in our times. The world is full of either one or the other, but the idea of a nation soul is really an evolving idea that we need to engage with by looking at, in depth at what really it is, and what is the paradox in it. What is
True.
the source of unity in it? Those are the things that we need to engage with to fulfill
Fulfill
what
the
it is
mission.
that we
Yeah,
can do. Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely, and not do the errors of the past, which have
Yes.
led to such disastrous
Yes.
consequences, and all have suffered. So definitely that is the dangers which are also shown in the whole journey, and also possibilities. So both the sides, possibilities as well as the
Yes.
lack of it, both are equally, you can say, that is what it makes is the adventure, something, a path in the unknown. It's the path
Yes.
is not slow mechanically carved out that it can go to that specific end in the specific way. It needs
Yes.
to be explored, as you rightly said. It is to be evolved, and the process, everything is getting evolved towards that end of the divine oneness. And that is how the whole journey is. And that's what makes it worthwhile to be doing it. So thank you so much, Devashishji. Sir, it has been always a
Thank you.
pleasure to reading you, listening to you, and talking to you. But today it was especially wonderful, I must say. And I look forward to having more and more conversations and talks, or the communication with you.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Shubharat.
Shubharatri.